The moment someone senses weakness in you, a quiet calculation begins. It is rarely announced, rarely aggressive in its first appearance, and almost never acknowledged openly. But somewhere in the architecture of the other person's mind, an adjustment is made, a subtle recalibration that shifts how they see you, how they speak to you, and how far they are willing to push. Your words are weighed a little more skeptically. Your stated limits are tested a little more often. Your reactions are studied with a patience that can feel almost clinical. This is not because every person you encounter is cruel or deliberately calculating. It is because human beings are, at their core, instinctive strategists. When opportunity appears, most people move toward it, often without even consciously realizing they have done so. You may want to believe that the people around you evaluate you based on fairness, logic, or demonstrated competence. And in an ideal world, perhaps they would. But most real environments, professional, social, romantic, or otherwise, operate on a far simpler and more ancient signal. People watch for who bends and who holds firm. They observe who hesitates at the critical moment and who moves with calm, unhesitating clarity. They notice who silently craves approval and who seems entirely unbothered by its absence. They study whether your limits are real or decorative, whether your confidence is grounded or performed, whether you are someone who can be moved or someone who cannot. These observations happen quickly, quietly, and without mercy. Machiavelli understood this centuries before modern psychology had the vocabulary to describe it. Power, he wrote, is not simply a matter of force or formal authority. It is fundamentally a matter of perception. The moment others come to believe that you can be easily influenced, easily pressured, or easily destabilized, your position weakens without a single direct confrontation ever taking place. You do not need to lose an argument to lose ground. You only need to signal through your behavior, your body language, your words, or your patterns that you are the kind of person who can be moved. And the unsettling truth is that most people are broadcasting that signal far more loudly and far more consistently than they realize. What follows are the 6 specific weaknesses that people detect and begin to exploit almost immediately, not after months of close observation, but often within a single conversation, a single meeting, or a single negotiation. Understanding each of them is not about becoming paranoid or cold. It is about becoming honest, perhaps for the first time, about the messages you have been sending. The first weakness, and perhaps the most widespread, is the need to be liked. This vulnerability is uniquely dangerous because it does not arrive looking like a weakness at all. It arrives wearing the clothing of something admirable. You want harmony. You want the people around you to feel comfortable. You want to be someone who does not create unnecessary friction or make others feel criticized or unwelcome. These are not bad instincts in isolation. The problem is what happens when they stop being instincts and become compulsions, when the need for people to approve of you quietly begins to govern your behavior in ways you do not fully notice. You soften your honest opinions to match what the room appears to want. You laugh at things that do not genuinely amuse you because not laughing feels risky. You agree with positions you privately find questionable because disagreement feels dangerous, like it might cost you something warm and important. You absorb small slights without naming them, not out of wisdom, but out of fear that naming them will make you seem difficult or oversensitive. You go out of your way to make people comfortable, even at the expense of your own comfort, your own truth, or your own position. At first, none of this feels like a problem. It passes itself off as social grace, diplomacy, emotional maturity. But consider what it actually communicates. When others sense that your approval from them matters deeply to you, they gain a form of leverage that requires no aggression and no confrontation. All they have to do is withdraw warmth slightly, become a little cooler, a little more distant, a little less affirming, and then observe what you do in response. If you adjust your behavior to recover the approval you have just lost, if you soften your position, or increase your agreeableness, or become suddenly more accommodating, you have answered the only question that mattered. You have confirmed that you can be moved by the withdrawal of approval, and once that is confirmed, it can be used. This dynamic operates in workplaces, in friendships, in romantic relationships, in families, and in negotiations of every kind. The person who needs to be liked is easier to underpay, easier to overburden, easier to dismiss, and easier to manipulate than the person who does not. Not because the people doing these things are monsters, but because leverage, once discovered, tends to be used. The Stoic philosophers understood this long before the language of modern psychology existed to describe it. If your sense of your own value depends on the ongoing reactions of other people, then other people effectively control your emotional climate, and people, consciously or not, tend to use whatever they find themselves controlling. The path out of this is not to stop caring about others, or to become deliberately cold and indifferent. It is to build a stable enough foundation inside yourself that external approval becomes something you can appreciate when it arrives without needing it in order to function. When you reach that point, the leverage disappears. You can no longer be moved by the withdrawal of warmth, because your sense of yourself does not depend on the warmth being there. The second weakness people exploit almost immediately is visible insecurity. Like the need to be liked, this one often masquerades as something virtuous. You call it humility. You frame it as honesty about your limitations. You say things like, "I am probably wrong about this," before presenting a position you have thought carefully about. You add, "This might be a terrible idea, but," before sharing something genuinely worth considering. You preface your contributions with long disclaimers about what you do not know, what you might have missed, and how much smarter everyone else in the room probably is on this particular subject. Spoken occasionally, in the right context, these phrases can be genuine and appropriate. Real intellectual humility is a quality worth having. But when these phrases become a reflex, when they appear at the beginning of nearly everything you say, not because you are genuinely uncertain, but because you have learned that preemptive self-deprecation feels safer than the risk of being wrong in public. They do something that genuine humility never does. They frame you as someone who is uncertain about their own ground, and uncertainty about your own ground is an open invitation for pressure. Think about what actually happens when someone presents an idea and immediately downplays it before a single person in the room has responded. The room does not receive the idea and then separately receive the person's doubt about it. The doubt becomes part of the idea itself. The hesitation is absorbed along with the content, and once hesitation has entered the room, it is very difficult to replace with anything you say afterward. You have undermined yourself before anyone else had the chance to, and the people who were already inclined to push back, who were already looking for an opening, have just been handed one. Machiavelli believed that effective leaders had to project confidence even during periods of genuine uncertainty, not because pretending to know everything is wise or even honest, but because stability of appearance has the practical effect of stabilizing the environment around you. When the person at the front of the room appears steady, the room steadies. When the person at the front of the room appears uncertain, the room feels permission to be uncertain too, and then to look for someone more certain to follow. Confidence, properly understood, is not arrogance. It is composure under evaluation. It is the ability to hold yourself together while the world is watching and deciding what to make of you. Visible insecurity signals that the floor of your self-belief is closer to the surface than people assumed, and people who sense a soft floor will keep pressing down until they find it. The third weakness is emotional reactivity, and it may be the most dangerous of the six. If someone discovers, through accident, through probing or through deliberate experiment, that you respond intensely and immediately to criticism, to teasing, to challenges to your competence, or even to mild dismissal, they have just learned exactly how to move you whenever they choose. A small remark becomes a lever. A casually timed insult becomes bait. A strategic challenge to your area of expertise becomes a mechanism for pulling you off balance and keeping you there. And without fully understanding how it happened, you find yourself spending enormous amounts of energy defending your position, rather than advancing it. Robert Greene, in his extensive writing on the dynamics of power, describes how emotional reactions essentially hand other people a detailed and reliable map of your vulnerabilities. When someone knows what provokes you, which topics, which tones, which specific challenges, they can guide your behavior, influence your decisions, and drain your focus without ever needing to overpower you directly or demonstrate any greater capability. They only need to know which points on the map to press and when. And the tragedy is that most people reveal that map very quickly, very clearly, and entirely voluntarily. A single sarcastic comment online draws a lengthy, heated, disproportionate response. A dismissive tone in a meeting produces immediate and visible defensiveness that everyone in the room registers. A challenge to a person's stated area of expertise pulls them into an extended debate they never intended to enter, in which they say far more than serves their interests and far less than they imagined. In each of these moments, the person making the provocation has learned something valuable. They have identified a point of control, and once that knowledge exists, the dynamic shifts permanently. They no longer need strength. They only need patience and timing. There is also a compounding effect to emotional reactivity that makes it particularly worth understanding. Each time you react visibly to a provocation, the other person's confidence in their ability to move you increases. They probe again, this time more precisely. The provocations become more targeted. The leverage grows. What began as a single exchange in which someone discovered they could unsettle you eventually becomes a sustained dynamic in which you are perpetually reactive in their presence, perpetually behind, perpetually defending, rather than directing. Learning to receive provocation without immediately responding is not passivity. It is one of the most active and demanding forms of self-governance available to any person willing to practice it. The Stoics called it the gap between stimulus and response, the space in which freedom actually lives. The fourth weakness that people detect and exploit almost immediately is desperation. Desperation for a job, desperation for a relationship, desperation for a deal, for validation, for belonging, for any outcome you have quietly decided you cannot afford to lose. When someone senses that you cannot walk away, that you have no real alternatives, that you need this particular outcome more than they do, the balance of power between you shifts in a way that is very difficult to reverse once it has taken hold. Negotiations become shorter and less generous. The respect extended to you becomes thinner and more conditional. The terms you are offered become heavier and less fair, and they keep moving in that direction for as long as your desperation remains visible and unaddressed. You may never say the word desperate aloud. You may never explicitly acknowledge how much is riding on this particular outcome, but your urgency reveals it regardless. You respond to every message within seconds when others are taking hours. You accept conditions you would never have considered acceptable under ordinary circumstances. You tolerate behavior from others that you would normally name and push back against, because the cost of protecting your dignity now feels higher than the cost of absorbing the disrespect. Machiavelli wrote that power depends substantially on the perception that you have genuine alternatives. If others come to believe that you have nowhere else to go, they stop negotiating with you in any meaningful sense. They begin to dictate, and they do so because the situation allows it. The dynamic is not personal, it is structural. The person who has options, or who at least credibly appears to have options, occupies an entirely different position in any exchange than the person who does not. Cultivating real alternatives in your professional life, in your relationships, and in your sense of what you can and cannot live without is not a cynical strategy. It is the practical foundation of your ability to engage with the world on terms that respect you rather than diminish you. Desperation removes the appearance of choice, and the appearance of choice is inseparable from the reality of leverage. The fifth weakness people exploit is the absence of clear and consistent limits. This exploitation rarely begins with anything dramatic or obviously aggressive. It begins with small tests, the kind that can always be passed off as accidents or honest oversights if you raise them. Someone interrupts you repeatedly in conversation, and you let it pass. Someone assigns you tasks that were never part of any agreement, and you absorb them quietly, rather than addressing the scope creep. Someone makes jokes at your expense with a frequency and an edge that begins to feel less like humor and more like low-grade contempt, and you smile through it because saying something feels like it might create an uncomfortable moment. In each of these situations, you are making a decision about where your line stands. And in each moment that you tolerate the behavior without any response, you communicate something clearly, that the line is further back than the other person initially assumed. The behavior that was once a test becomes a pattern. The pattern becomes an established norm. The norm becomes the baseline expectation for how you are treated. And by the time you finally say something, if you ever do, you are not simply addressing a single incident. You are trying to crawl back ground that has been seeded gradually over a long period of time. And that is a much harder position to argue from than if you had held the line at the beginning. Nietzsche observed that human beings push limits until they encounter genuine resistance, and that this process is often entirely unconscious. People probe structure the way water probes the edges of a container, not always with malice, but with the persistent directionless pressure of a force looking for the path of least resistance. If the container gives a little every time pressure is applied, the pressure naturally increases. If it holds firm, the pressure redistributes elsewhere. This is not a moral statement about human nature. It is a practical observation about how behavior in the absence of clear structure actually operates. Limits are not acts of aggression, they are acts of definition. They communicate the shape of who you are and what you will and will not accommodate. When others understand where your line stands, they adjust accordingly, often without any drama or confrontation being necessary at all. When the line is invisible, the testing continues until something eventually gives. The sixth weakness, and the one that receives perhaps the least attention in conversations about power and influence, is the compulsive need to explain everything. This pattern is subtle enough that it is often mistaken for thoroughness, conscientiousness, or a desire to be understood. And on some level, it is those things. But beneath that surface, at its functional root, over-explanation is an anxiety response. It is what happens when a person is not fully confident that their position can hold on its own, and so they attempt to compensate with volume. More words, more reasoning, more evidence, more clarification, in the hope that sheer quantity will settle the matter. When someone challenges your decision or your position, and you respond with an extensive, multi-layered justification that continues well past the point where the question was actually answered, something subtle but significant happens. You surrender authority in the very act of defending it. Real authority, the kind that is felt before it is analyzed, the kind that changes the atmosphere of a room, rarely needs excessive explanation. It states its position clearly, and then it holds the resulting silence without apparent anxiety. Think of the calmest and most genuinely grounded person you have encountered in a tense professional situation. They do not rush to justify every word. They do not produce elaborate chains of reasoning designed to convince every skeptic in the room. They say what needs to be said as briefly and clearly as possible, and then they stop. They allow silence to function as a statement rather than rushing to fill it, because the silence makes them nervous. Over-explanation communicates something to every person in the room who is paying attention. It tells them that you are not entirely sure your position can hold under sustained examination, and that you are aware of this, and that you are trying to paper over the uncertainty with additional words. And that awareness, once others sense it, invites exactly the kind of further questioning and challenge that you were hoping the additional words would prevent. The strategy creates the problem it was designed to solve. Strategic communicators have understood for centuries that precision carries more weight than volume. that fewer words used with confidence communicate more authority than many words delivered with anxiety. Every sentence you add beyond what the moment actually requires is an opening, another surface against which pressure can be applied, another opportunity for inconsistency to appear. Understanding these 6 weaknesses does not mean transforming yourself into someone cold, suspicious of every social interaction, or perpetually braced for the worst in people. That posture would be as damaging in its own way as the vulnerabilities it attempts to address. The person who lives in a state of constant defensive alertness finds that genuine connection becomes impossible, which creates its own particular kind of isolation and weakness. The goal is not to become a fortress. The goal is to become honest, genuinely and sometimes uncomfortably honest, about the signals you have been broadcasting, perhaps for years, without fully understanding what they were communicating or who was receiving them. It is also worth understanding that these 6 weaknesses do not typically appear in isolation. They travel together and reinforce each other in ways that make any single one of them harder to address without looking at the others. The person who needs approval is also the person most likely to over-explain, because over-explanation is at its core a form of seeking approval after the fact. The person who carries visible insecurity is also the person most likely to react emotionally to criticism, because criticism lands hardest when it confirms a fear you are already carrying about yourself. The person who shows desperation is also the person most likely to allow their limits to erode, because when you need something badly enough, the cost of protecting your boundaries begins to feel too high to pay. These patterns loop into each other and strengthen each other, and addressing only one while leaving the others intact rarely produces lasting change. The transformation that actually sticks is internal. When you stop chasing approval as though your sense of yourself depends on receiving it, others lose their ability to manipulate your behavior by withholding it. When you regulate your emotional reactions to provocation, provocations run dry because there is nothing useful for the provocateur to learn from the exchange. When you maintain real alternatives in your life, desperation loses the conditions it needs to grow. When you establish limits early and hold them consistently, disrespect struggles to find a foothold because there is no opening from the start. When you speak with precision and then hold the silence that follows, authority strengthens quietly and without effort. People begin treating you differently when these shifts take hold, often without being able to articulate exactly why. They extend more consideration to what you say. They push back less reflexively. They treat your time and your attention as things that carry genuine value. This change does not happen because you have become more aggressive or more dominant. It happens because stability is sensed before it is understood. Human beings are drawn toward people who appear internally anchored, who carry themselves with a quality of steadiness that suggests they will not be easily rattled, swayed, or diminished by ordinary pressure. Not rigidity, not hostility, just steadiness. And steadiness, quietly but reliably, makes the entire apparatus of exploitation significantly harder to operate. The Stoics believed that true strength was never about domination over others. It was always, in the end, about mastery over oneself. Marcus Aurelius returned to this theme throughout the private journals we now call the Meditations, the notes he wrote for himself, never for an audience, during years of enormous pressure and responsibility. What he concluded across years of sustained reflection was that the untrained mind is at the mercy of every force that passes through its environment. Every criticism lands as a wound. Every withdrawal of approval feels like abandonment. Every provocation finds its mark. Every negotiation begins from a position of disadvantage because the desperation is already visible in how you carry yourself. The disciplined mind sits at the center of all of that and remains essentially still, not unmoved in the sense of being indifferent, but unmoved in the sense of not being pulled off its own axis by pressures that are, when examined clearly, external to who you actually are. Go their entire lives broadcasting the same signals wondering why the same patterns keep recurring in their relationships, their careers, and their sense of where they stand in the world. They will look outward for explanations, cataloging the faults and strategies of the people who have taken advantage, identifying the manipulators and the opportunists, telling themselves the story that the problem has always been out there, in other people, in bad luck, in unfair systems. And sometimes those things are real. But the more useful examination, the one that actually changes things, has always been available closer than that. The question of why certain dynamics keep following you from one environment to the next cannot always be answered by studying those environments. Often, it can only be fully answered by studying the signals you are sending into them. Awareness, once it genuinely arrives, changes everything it touches. The person who does this work, who looks honestly at which of these 6 weaknesses operates most strongly in their own behavior, and begins the slow, patient, unglamorous process of addressing it, carries something forward that cannot easily be taken from them. A settled, quiet, unperformative knowledge of their own ground. Not armor, not aggression. Just clarity about who they are and where they stand. That clarity, in any environment and against any pressure, is what makes exploitation not merely difficult, but very nearly impossible. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more on the psychology of power, influence, and what it actually takes to carry yourself in a way that commands genuine respect.